The unseen battle of elegance and arrogance. The grand chandelier sparkled above the lavish ballroom, casting a golden glow over the room where the crème de la crème of high society gathered. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the soft hum of polite conversation. The annual Elysian Charity Gala was in full swing, a night dedicated to raising funds for underprivileged children, but in reality, a battlefield of social supremacy where power was measured in diamonds, designer gowns, and who could outshine the rest. Sandra Bullock had attended the gala for years, not as a show of wealth, but as a sincere supporter of the cause. Unlike most of the guests flaunting their status, she believed in using her influence for good. That night, she had chosen a simple yet elegant midnight blue dress, her hair styled in a sleek updo, and her makeup minimal, allowing her natural beauty to shine. She never needed to demand attention. It followed her wherever she went. As Sandra entered, the murmurs began. Did she forget this is a gala, not a PTA meeting? Eleanor Cartwright whispered to her friend, Vivian Street James, her voice laced with feigned amusement. Eleanor and Vivian were the self-appointed queens of society, their wealth spanning generations, their influence built on legacy rather than merit. They wore extravagant gowns adorned with rare gemstones, their necks weighed down by glistening necklaces that cost more than an average home. But what they thrived on most wasn't their riches. It was their ability to make others feel small. Sandra, oblivious to their whispering, made her way through the ballroom, greeting old friends and exchanging warm smiles. She was here for the children, for the foundation that had built schools and shelters, for the cause that mattered. But Eleanor and Vivian had no interest in philanthropy beyond what it did for their public image. As Sandra reached the donation booth, she placed a sealed envelope into the box, a humble act unnoticed by most. What no one knew was that inside was a personal check of $2 million, more than any donation made that evening. Vivian let out an exaggerated gasp, nudging Eleanor. "Oh dear, look." She put in an envelope. "How quaint. Probably a discount coupon for Whole Foods," Eleanor quipped, barely containing her laughter. The women around them chuckled, their laughter dripping with condescension. But the joke was on them, and they were about to find out in the most unexpected way. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit corner of the ballroom, Keanu Reeves observed the scene with quiet intensity. He had arrived discreetly, dressed in a classic black suit, his presence effortless yet commanding. Unlike the others, he had no desire to bask in the grandeur. He was here for the cause, just like Sandra. And now, he watched as the woman he had known for years, a woman he deeply respected, was being subtly ridiculed by women whose kindness was as artificial as their perfectly sculpted features. Keanu Reeves was known for many things: his humility, his generosity, his kindness. But if there was one thing he could not stand, it was arrogance at the expense of others. And tonight, he wasn't going to sit back and let it slide. This was far from over. The whispered insults that went too far. The gala was in full swing, but for Sandra Bullock, it had begun to feel like a stage where silent judgment was the main performance. The clinking of glasses, the polite yet empty laughter, and the occasional side glances from the society elite were nothing new to her. She had been in the industry long enough to know that money did not always come with class. She had spent decades perfecting the art of ignoring sneers. But tonight, something about the murmurs stung more than usual. Maybe it was the fact that she was alone, without an entourage or stylists hovering around her. Maybe it was the way Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian Street James had made no effort to hide their condescension. Eleanor, a woman whose wealth was inherited rather than earned, sipped her champagne lazily, her fingers adorned with diamonds the size of ice cubes. She leaned closer to Vivian, her voice just loud enough for Sandra to hear. "I can't decide if she's here to donate or to apply for a catering job." Eleanor sneered, her lips curling into an amused smirk. Vivian, equally ruthless in her judgment, laughed behind her glass. "I mean, it's tragic, isn't it? She could have at least borrowed something from the costume department. That dress looks like it came from a department store sale rack. The women around them chuckled softly, their laughter like nails against glass. It was the kind of venom only the rich could disguise under the pretense of sophistication. Sandra swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She wasn't one to let cruel words affect her, but something about their tone, their audacity, made her blood simmer. Not because she was embarrassed. She was far past the stage of caring about shallow opinions, but because she knew their words were meant to wound, meant to remind her that in their eyes, she would never be one of them. She turned to face them, keeping her expression composed, her smile unfaltering. "I didn't realize charity galas had a dress code for kindness," she said smoothly. "Though I suppose if they did, neither of you would have been let in." The smile on Eleanor's face faltered for just a second before she regained her composure. "Oh dear," she sighed dramatically. "It's adorable how you try to act above it all. Tell me, does that attitude come with the lack of culture, or is it just a personal touch?" Sandra had faced criticism before, on red carpets, in interviews, from tabloids dissecting her every move. But this was the kind of elitism that turned charity into a competition of wealth, the kind that made giving seem like a performance rather than an act of goodwill. And it disgusted her. Just as she was about to respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension like a knife. "That's an interesting way to treat the woman who just donated more than everyone in this room combined." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Heads turned. The quiet power in the voice was undeniable, and when its owner stepped forward, the reaction was almost instant. Keanu Reeves. Dressed in an effortlessly sleek black suit, his presence commanded the kind of attention no amount of wealth could buy. Unlike the men parading around the gala flaunting their status, Keanu carried himself with something far rarer: authenticity. He was the kind of person who didn't need to boast, the kind who could silence a room with nothing more than his presence. Eleanor and Vivian stiffened, their eyes widening in surprise. They hadn't even realized he had been in the room, let alone within earshot. "Keanu," Sandra said, surprised but relieved. "I didn't know you were coming." He smiled, a small, reassuring expression meant only for her. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But I'm glad I did." Turning back to Eleanor and Vivian, his expression shifted into something unreadable. "It's always interesting," he said slowly, "to see who people really are when they think no one is watching." Eleanor opened her mouth, likely to defend herself, but Keanu wasn't finished. "You mock a woman who has spent decades using her platform to help others. You laugh at someone whose generosity outweighs anything your bank accounts could ever offer. And for what? Because she doesn't drape herself in diamonds like a trophy." Vivian cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. "We were just joking, Keanu. There's no need to." "No need to what?" Keanu interrupted, his voice calm but unwavering. "No need to call out cruelty when I see it. No need to remind you that this gala is meant for charity, not a parade of self-importance." The murmurs in the room grew louder. People were beginning to pay attention, sensing the tension unfolding before them. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others intrigued. Eleanor, realizing she was on the losing end of this conversation, huffed dramatically. "We didn't mean any harm. If Sandra's feelings are so fragile, that's hardly our fault." Keanu let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You mistake her grace for fragility," he said. "That's where you went wrong." Eleanor's face turned a shade of red that no amount of foundation could conceal. Before she could respond, a waiter stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Reeves, Miss Bullock," he said hesitantly, "I've just been informed that the board of the charity would like to make an announcement regarding a special donor." Keanu and Sandra exchanged glances, but before either of them could respond, a voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, may we have your attention, please?" The room fell into silence once more. At the front of the ballroom, the event's host, a well-respected philanthropist, stood behind the podium, a warm smile on his face. "Tonight, We are honored to acknowledge the largest single donation our foundation has ever received. A donation made not for publicity, not for status, but out of sheer generosity. Please join me in thanking. He paused for effect, then continued, Miss Sandra Bullock. A stunned silence stretched across the ballroom before polite applause followed. Some clapped in genuine admiration, others in reluctant acknowledgement. But the looks on Eleanor and Vivian's faces, priceless. Keanu leaned in slightly toward them and smirked. Would you like to borrow an envelope? Seems like you forgot to bring yours. Eleanor and Vivian, faces burning with embarrassment, quickly excused themselves, disappearing into the crowd. Sandra, still slightly stunned, turned to Keanu. You didn't have to do that. He shrugged, his smirk turning into a genuine smile. Of course I did. Someone had to remind them that kindness always wins. Sandra laughed softly, shaking her head. Well, I'm glad you showed up. Keanu took her hand, giving it a small squeeze. Always. The night carried on, the weight of judgment now replaced with admiration. And though Sandra had never needed validation, knowing that someone like Keanu had her back made the night a little bit brighter. What Eleanor and Vivian had failed to realize was that power wasn't in money. It was in integrity. And tonight, they had been taught that lesson the hard way. The silent applause that echoed louder than words. The room still buzzed with murmurs, the kind that lingered when something truly unexpected happens. People exchanged glances, some leaning in to whisper their thoughts to one another. Others simply watched, too fascinated to look away. The hum of quiet astonishment rippled through the extravagant gala, a setting meant for wealth and status, now shaken by a rare and genuine moment of truth. Sandra Bullock stood still for a moment, allowing herself to take it all in. She had spent so many years in Hollywood where people carefully curated their words, their expressions, their very existence to fit into society's mold. But here, at a charity event meant to be about giving, she had been reminded that not everyone truly understood generosity. It was a show to them, a display of wealth and power, rather than a true act of goodwill. But then there was Keanu. She turned to look at him, his face calm as always, but there was something in his eyes that told her he had been holding back. Not out of anger. Keanu Reeves was not the kind of man who let rage control him, but out of deep-seated disappointment. She had known him long enough to understand that he despised injustice, whether big or small. He had always been this way. The moment between them was broken when an older man, one of the event's board members, approached Keanu with an almost apologetic smile. Mr. Reeves, I have to say, it's rare to see someone stand up for others in this crowd. We see a lot of posturing, but that was something else. Keanu shook the man's hand politely, but his response was simple. There shouldn't have been anything to stand up for. Sandra felt those words hit deep. She knew exactly what he meant. The night had started as an opportunity to raise money for a cause, and yet it had turned into a spectacle of judgment and whispered cruelty. Just then, Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian Street James reappeared, though their presence was much more subdued. They no longer held their glasses with the same smug confidence. Their shoulders were a little stiffer, their steps a little less self-assured. Sandra could almost hear the conversations they must have had after walking away. Arguing, defending themselves, scrambling to repair their damaged pride. But now, as they stood before her and Keanu, there was a hesitation neither of them had shown before. Sandra, Eleanor started, her voice carefully composed. I believe we may have misjudged the situation. Vivian nodded, forcing a smile. What Eleanor means is, we didn't realize you had such a, substantial role in tonight's event. Sandra raised an eyebrow. Substantial role, she repeated. Keanu folded his arms, watching them closely. They were trying to salvage their dignity, but Sandra could see it for what it was, damage control. Eleanor sighed dramatically, as if the words pained her. Look, we didn't mean to make you feel out of place. It was just unnecessary. Keanu finished for her, his tone neutral but firm. It was unnecessary. Eleanor and Vivian exchanged quick glances before Eleanor cleared her throat. In any case, she continued, her voice slightly more rigid, we hope there are no hard feelings. Sandra considered their words for a long moment. She wasn't one to hold grudges, but she also wasn't naive enough to believe that these women had suddenly found their moral compass. They weren't apologizing because they had grown as people. They were apologizing because they had been exposed. Instead of answering, she simply smiled and said, "Enjoy the rest of your evening." Eleanor's lips pressed together tightly, as if she had hoped for something else. Maybe forgiveness, maybe validation. But when neither Sandra nor Keanu gave her any further response, she and Vivian gave tight nods before retreating into the crowd. As soon as they were gone, Sandra let out a small breath of laughter. That was the most insincere apology I've ever heard. Keanu chuckled. They're not used to being called out. Sandra shook her head, taking a sip from the champagne she had barely touched all night. No, they're used to being worshipped. There's a difference. Keanu nodded, glancing around the room. He could feel the eyes on them. Some admiring, some merely entertained by the drama that had unfolded. But among them, he spotted something else. A few waiters, staff members, and other guests who hadn't been given the spotlight, but had clearly been watching the entire situation play out. One of the younger servers, a woman in her early 20s, hesitated before stepping forward. She held a tray, but her voice was soft when she spoke. "Miss Bullock, Mr. Reeves," she said, "I just wanted to say thank you." Most people wouldn't have said anything, even if they saw what was happening. Keanu gave her a small, warm smile. That's the problem, isn't it? Too many people see, but not enough people act. Sandra reached for the young woman's hand, giving it a light squeeze. You deserve to be treated with respect, just like everyone else in this room. The woman's eyes glistened slightly before she nodded, then quickly stepped away before drawing too much attention to herself. Sandra turned to Keanu. You realize you just made me the most talked about person at this event, right? He smirked, sipping his drink. Isn't that why I showed up? Sandra laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible. The evening carried on, but something had shifted. The air was different now. It wasn't just about donations and social posturing anymore. At least, not entirely. It was about the conversations that had sparked from a single moment of truth. And somewhere in the back of the room, Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian Street James sat quietly at their table, their usual confidence somewhat shaken. Because for the first time in a long time, they weren't the ones controlling the story. That honor belonged to Sandra Bullock. And of course, to the man who never needed the spotlight, yet always seemed to find himself in the center of something extraordinary. The weight of silent battles. The gala continued in its usual grandeur, with guests sipping their expensive champagne and engaging in half-hearted conversations about philanthropy, success, and their latest extravagant purchases. But beneath the gilded surface, an unspoken shift had occurred. Sandra Bullock could feel it in the glances thrown her way, the hushed whispers that trailed behind her like ripples in still water. Some admired her, some envied her, and a select few, like Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian Street James, resented her. But what mattered most to Sandra was that, for the first time in a long time, she had spoken her truth without sugarcoating it to fit into the fragile egos of the elite. She sighed, running her fingers along the rim of her glass. It's funny, you know, she mused, her voice just loud enough for Keanu to hear. I spent years believing I had to smile through everything. That if I just stayed polite, played the part, people would see me for more than just a woman who got lucky in Hollywood. But I realize now, they never cared about me. Not really. Keanu listened intently, his gaze steady. People like Eleanor and Vivian don't care about who you are, Sandra. They care about where you rank. And the second they think you fall beneath them, they try to remind you of your place. Sandra let out a humorless chuckle. And here I thought I had outgrown this nonsense. Keanu leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You outgrew it a long time ago. They're the ones still trapped in a world where status is the only currency that matters. A moment of silence passed between them. Sandra felt the familiar burn of frustration bubbling inside her, not because of what had happened, but because of how many times she had seen it play out before. The only difference tonight was that she had refused to stay quiet. Just then, the event's keynote speaker, a well-respected philanthropist, took the stage, his voice booming through the microphone as he spoke about the importance of giving back. The irony wasn't lost on Sandra. These people, these same people who had dismissed her, judged her, would now write checks with their diamond-clad hands and pat themselves on the back for their generosity. And tomorrow, they would go back to their world of privilege, never sparing a thought for the causes they so publicly supported. Sandra turned her attention back to Keanu, who sat with an almost amused expression, watching the audience react to the speech. What? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Keanu smirked. I'm just waiting to see how many people here actually believe a word of what he's saying. Sandra rolled her eyes but smiled despite herself. Cynical as ever, I see. Keanu shrugged, leaning back in his chair. Not cynical, just observant. Sandra knew what he meant. She had seen it too, the way certain guests barely paid attention, checking their phones instead of listening, nodding along only when they knew the cameras were watching. And yet, for all their self-importance, none of them had spoken up when Eleanor and Vivian had tried to humiliate her earlier. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of silverware clinking. The dinner service had begun, and waiters moved seamlessly through the ballroom, placing plates of meticulously arranged dishes in front of each guest. Sandra barely touched hers, her appetite replaced by the lingering frustration from earlier. As she absently pushed a piece of asparagus around her plate, Keanu suddenly spoke, his tone quieter than before. You okay? She looked up at him, considering the question. Was she? Part of her still felt the sting of being treated like an outsider in a space where she had every right to belong. But another part of her felt something different, something lighter, because for once, she hadn't let them dictate how she felt about herself. Yeah, she finally said, I think I am. Keanu nodded, satisfied with her answer. Good, because those two don't deserve a second more of your energy. Sandra exhaled slowly, letting his words settle in. He was right. She had spent enough time caring about the opinions of people who would never truly see her, and she refused to waste another moment on them. But as the night continued, something unexpected happened. Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian Street James weren't done with her yet. And this time, they had a plan. The game they played. The evening's program progressed as scheduled, but beneath the surface, something darker brewed. Sandra could sense it. The way Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian Street James exchanged knowing glances, the hushed whispers and smirks that followed in her wake. They weren't finished. Not yet. Their kind never was. Women like Eleanor and Vivian thrived on control, on power, on reminding others of the invisible hierarchy they had built for themselves. And tonight, Sandra had disrupted that order. She wasn't sure how, but she knew they were planning something. She could feel it in the weight of their stares, the way they lingered just long enough to make her aware of their presence, but not long enough for anyone else to notice. It was subtle, calculated. The kind of social warfare that only the wealthy and well-connected knew how to execute flawlessly. She was still sitting next to Keanu when the charity auction began. Next, we have a special item. A rare first edition copy of Pride and Prejudice, donated by none other than the Cartwright Foundation, the auctioneer announced. A spotlight landed on Eleanor, who lifted her champagne glass in acknowledgement, feigning modesty as applause echoed through the room. Sandra wasn't impressed. She had seen this before, a carefully crafted moment designed to reinforce Eleanor's status, her supposed generosity. It was never about the cause. It was about perception. The bids started rolling in, climbing quickly. $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. Eleanor smiled, clearly pleased. But then, as if on cue, Vivian leaned in toward Sandra, her voice just loud enough to be heard over the murmurs. I suppose this is a bit out of your price range, dear. Sandra stiffened, her grip tightening around her glass. Keanu, who had been casually watching the auction, turned his attention to Vivian. His expression remained calm, unreadable. But Sandra had known him long enough to recognize the shift. It was subtle, but it was there, a quiet intensity beneath the surface. Before Sandra could respond, Eleanor joined in, her tone dripping with artificial sweetness. Oh, don't be cruel, Vivian. I'm sure Sandra gives back in her own modest way. Laughter. Soft, polite, but filled with mockery. Sandra exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay composed. This was what they wanted, a reaction. A sign that their words had landed, that they still held the power they so desperately clung to. Keanu's voice cut through the noise, calm but firm. Actually, Sandra has done more for charity than most people in this room. Eleanor and Vivian turned toward him, feigning amusement. Oh, is that so? Eleanor asked, tilting her head. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Yes, but she doesn't need to flaunt it. The words landed harder than either of them expected. A flicker of something, discomfort, perhaps, crossed Eleanor's face. But she recovered quickly, her smile never faltering. How noble, she mused. Still, there's something to be said for appearances, don't you think? Sandra had had enough. She set her glass down and turned fully toward Eleanor and Vivian, meeting their condescending smiles with one of her own. Yes, she said smoothly. I suppose that's why you two spend so much time perfecting yours. A beat of silence. Then Keanu chuckled, low and genuine. The sound of it made Eleanor's expression tighten ever so slightly. Vivian cleared her throat, shifting in her seat. Well, I suppose some of us just understand the importance of maintaining a certain standard. Sandra didn't miss the implication, but instead of responding, she simply smiled, reaching for her purse. You're absolutely right, she said, pulling out a checkbook. Eleanor and Vivian watched, intrigued but wary, as Sandra tore a check from the book and handed it to the auctioneer. $50,000, Sandra announced. The room went silent. The auctioneer hesitated, then checked the amount before clearing his throat. We have a new bid. $50,000 from Ms. Bullock. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Even Keanu looked mildly surprised, though a small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Eleanor and Vivian, however, were frozen. Sandra turned to them, her voice light. You were saying something about maintaining a certain standard. Eleanor's jaw clenched. Vivian looked away, clearly mortified. The auctioneer waited, but no counterbid came, and just like that, the moment was over. The game they had been playing, the quiet war they had waged, had backfired. Sandra sat back in her chair, exhaling softly. She hadn't planned on bidding, but she had no regrets. The money would go to a good cause, and more importantly, she had taken back the narrative. Keanu leaned in slightly, his voice low. Remind me never to underestimate you. Sandra smiled. Smart man. Across the room, Eleanor and Vivian sat in stiff silence, their carefully constructed facades cracking under the weight of their own pettiness. Sandra had won, and the night wasn't over yet. The moment of truth. As the auctioneer's gavel struck down, finalizing Sandra's victorious bid, the weight of the moment settled over the grand ballroom. A murmur rippled through the room, some guests whispering in admiration, others exchanging surprised glances, while Eleanor and Vivian sat frozen in a silence so heavy it was almost deafening. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping against the stem of his wineglass. There was an amused glint in his eyes, but he remained quiet, allowing the moment to sink in. He had known Sandra for years, but even now she still had a way of surprising him. Eleanor Cartwright, still clutching her champagne flute a little too tightly, cleared her throat, forcing a smile. Well, she said, her voice saccharine sweet. That was certainly unexpected. Sandra turned to her, unfazed. Was it? Vivian shifted uncomfortably, her fingers adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. Oh, it's just that we didn't know you were so invested in the cause. The underlying insult was clear. In their world, generosity wasn't measured by intent, but by how publicly one displayed it. And before tonight, Sandra had never flaunted her wealth the way they did. Sandra tilted her head, studying them. That's the difference between us, isn't it? She said, her voice smooth, unbothered. You need an audience. I don't. Keanu chuckled softly. It was a small sound, but it was enough. Eleanor and Vivian bristled, realizing that their power over the situation had completely unraveled. And then the inevitable happened. Excuse me, Miss Bullock. A voice interrupted the tense exchange, drawing everyone's attention toward the approaching event coordinator. She was a composed woman in a sleek black dress, clutching a clipboard as if it were a shield. I just wanted to inform you that, given your incredible contribution tonight, the chairman would like to offer you a seat at the guest of honor table. Sandra raised an eyebrow. The guest of honor table. The one right in the center of the ballroom, where the most influential figures of the night sat. The table that, until now, Eleanor and Vivian had assumed belonged to them. Keanu exhaled a quiet breath, knowing exactly what was coming next. Of course, the coordinator continued, glancing hesitantly at Eleanor and Vivian. This does mean that we'll need to adjust some of the seating arrangements. And there it was. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as if to protest, but for the first time that evening, she seemed to realize that there was nothing she could do. No amount of whispered insults, condescending smiles, or manufactured exclusivity could change what had just happened. Sandra Bullock had outplayed them. Without another word, the coordinator signaled to the staff, who discreetly began rearranging the seating. As place cards were switched and chairs subtly shifted, it became clear Eleanor and Vivian were being moved away from the center of attention. For years, they had made a sport out of deciding who belonged and who didn't. And now, in an ironic twist of fate, they were the ones being cast aside. Sandra turned to Keanu, who simply raised an eyebrow. You planned this, didn't you? He murmured. Sandra smirked. Not at all. But I won't pretend I'm not enjoying it. The evening continued, but the energy had shifted. The whispers that had once been directed at Sandra had now turned toward Eleanor and Vivian. People who had once eagerly hovered around them were now curiously watching from a distance, their interest fading. Eleanor, struggling to maintain her composure, forced a smile as she leaned toward Vivian. It's just a table, she muttered, though it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself. But Sandra knew the truth. It wasn't just a table. It was the symbol of everything they had worked so hard to control. And tonight, they had lost it. Keanu watched as Sandra took her new seat, effortlessly falling into conversation with the evening's most esteemed guests. It wasn't about the money or the status. It never had been. It was about something much bigger: dignity, integrity, the quiet power of self-respect. And Sandra had won that battle without ever having to stoop to their level. As the orchestra played on and champagne glasses clinked around the room, Keanu couldn't help but smile. They had underestimated her, and he had a feeling they wouldn't make that mistake again. The grand final. As the final course of the evening was served, the energy in the ballroom had changed entirely. Where once Sandra Bullock had been a quiet observer, subtly dismissed by Eleanor and Vivian, she was now the most talked-about guest of the night. The auction had cemented her status, not just as a donor, but as someone of influence, someone who could not be ignored. Keanu Reeves watched all of this unfold with a quiet amusement. He had seen Sandra navigate Hollywood's toughest rooms, handle press scrutiny with effortless grace, and face personal hardships with resilience. But there was something particularly satisfying about watching her outclass these so-called social elites without ever needing to raise her voice or play their games. The evening continued, And while Sandra was busy conversing with prominent philanthropists and business moguls, Keanu noticed the way Eleanor and Vivian sat at their new table, one that was noticeably further from the main stage, tucked near the back, far from the spotlight they so desperately craved. Vivian was fuming, her grip on her wine glass so tight that Keanu thought she might shatter it. Eleanor, on the other hand, wore a forced smile, occasionally glancing toward Sandra, as if trying to pretend that being moved to the outskirts of the gala was of no consequence to her. But then something happened that neither of them could have predicted. The chairman of the charity, a distinguished older man named Richard Langston, approached Sandra's table with a microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his deep voice cutting through the hum of chatter, "I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge an individual whose generosity tonight has far exceeded our expectations." The room quieted. Keanu, knowing exactly where this was going, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "This evening," Langston continued, "we were fortunate enough to raise a record-breaking amount for our cause, all thanks to the incredible kindness of Ms. Sandra Bullock." A round of applause erupted, some polite, some genuinely enthusiastic. Cameras flashed as photographers quickly captured the moment, ensuring it would make headlines the next day. Sandra, always modest, smiled warmly and gave a small nod, but before she could say anything, Langston continued. "But more than that," he said, "what stood out to me was not just Ms. Bullock's financial generosity, but her grace. The ability to stand tall in a room where others may try to dim your light is a rare gift." That was it, the final blow. Keanu saw the exact moment Eleanor and Vivian realized what had just happened. The chairman was not just praising Sandra's donation. He was acknowledging everything that had transpired that evening. He was making it clear, in front of the entire elite crowd, that the petty attempts to undermine her had not gone unnoticed. Sandra, of course, remained poised. She stood, taking the microphone with a quiet confidence. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "But truly, the work this organization does, that's what deserves the recognition tonight." A graceful deflection. A reminder that she didn't need validation, that she hadn't done this for attention. Keanu's respect for her deepened in that moment. The applause resumed, but among the sea of clapping hands, Eleanor and Vivian sat motionless. It was one thing to be outbid in an auction, but to be called out, subtly but unmistakably, by the chairman of one of the most exclusive charity organizations in the city. That was a humiliation they would not soon recover from. As the gala began to wind down, Keanu and Sandra found themselves standing near the grand entrance, watching as guests began filtering out. "Well," Sandra said, turning to Keanu, "I think that went well." Keanu chuckled. "You handled that like a pro." She smirked. "I've had good training." Just then, Eleanor and Vivian walked past them, their heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Their expressions were tight, their postures stiff. Sandra gave them a polite nod. "Ladies." They didn't reply. They just kept walking, disappearing into the night, their reign over the evening long forgotten. Keanu let out a breath of laughter. "I give them a week before they try to spin the story in their favor." Sandra grinned. "Let them. The people who matter saw the truth." And with that, she linked her arm through Keanu's, and they stepped out into the cool night air, leaving behind a night that had proven one undeniable fact. True class isn't about wealth or exclusivity. It's about how you treat people when no one's watching. And tonight, Sandra Bullock had reminded everyone in that room exactly what real grace looked like.